1989, a family named Hendricks stands over a sediment-choked depression behind their roadside cave attraction in Wyandot County, Ohio, wondering if there is anything left underground worth putting on a brochure. 32 feet down a hand-built ladder drops into total darkness. They are not looking for history. They are looking for a new stretch of passage, something to keep tourists paying at the gate. What comes up out of that hole instead will end up anchoring one of the most precisely dated Ice Age sites in eastern North America. And it will reopen a question this particular stretch of ground had apparently been asking long before anyone brought a shovel near it, because the county this pit sits in carries a name that was never chosen at random: Wyandot County, named for the people who lived along this exact ridge of dolomite for generations. The last indigenous nation forced out of Ohio marched west in 1843. Their descendants are still here today, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, in Michigan, and in the accounts collected from Wyandot elders decades ago, long before any backhoe touched this hillside, there are references to ground very much like this. Ground that is said to hold something, ground you were not supposed to open. What was actually sealed under that hillside for 10,000 years? Why did a hole that had stayed shut since the end of the Ice Age choose this particular family, on this particular afternoon, to come open again? And if the people who lived here longest already had a name for ground like this, why did nobody think to ask them first? This is Sheridan Cave, and if the name means nothing to you, that is strange, because inside the field of Ice Age archaeology, this site gets discussed the way a lost manuscript gets discussed by historians who know exactly how rare it is. It sits under a low dolomite ridge in Wyandot County, Ohio, a short walk from a small commercial cave called Indian Trail Caverns. For decades, that cave survived on curious families pulling off a state route to pay a few dollars and walk underground to look at stalactites. By the late 1980s, business was fading, so the Hendricks family, who owned the property, decided to dig. Not careful test pits, a backhoe, and later heavier equipment, tearing into a depression on their land called Sheridan Pit, named for an earlier family who had lived there and reportedly heard the ground groan open in their yard one night, before filling the hole back in and trying to forget about it. Dick Hendricks and his son Keith were not looking for the Ice Age. They were looking for a new cave passage. What came up instead was bone. Dark, dense, heavy with age, pulled from dirt that had not seen daylight in more than 10,000 years. That is the version of the story people like to tell as a curiosity. A family digging for profit stumbles onto deep history. It is a nice story. It is not the whole story, because what came out of that sinkhole did not simply fill a museum drawer. It became part of the evidence used to timestamp some of the earliest confirmed human activity in the American Midwest. And the closer you look at how that evidence was actually pulled from the ground, the stranger the picture gets. To understand why this site carries the weight it does, picture what a sinkhole like this actually is. A funnel cut straight down through limestone and dolomite, more than 60 feet across and roughly 50 feet deep, opening into a narrow cave mouth on one side. For thousands of years, that funnel behaved exactly the way funnels behave. It caught things: rain, sediment, animals. More than 15,000 cubic yards of earth came out of that pit before anyone fully understood what they were standing inside of. That is not an exaggeration for effect. That is the reported volume of dirt moved by a family trying to expand a roadside attraction. Somewhere in those earliest truckloads, fragile evidence was almost certainly crushed, scattered, or lost before a single trained archaeologist ever set eyes on it. Nobody kept a careful log of what came out in those first weeks. By the time scientists arrived, the ground had already been rewritten once. Paleontologist Greg MacDonald was among the first researchers brought in, and what his teams recovered over the following summers reads like a species list from a vanished world. A giant, short-faced bear, close to twice the size of a modern grizzly. Flat-headed peccary, dozens of individuals, an entire herd's worth. Stag moose, giant beaver the size of a small dog crossed with a boulder. Small boreal species that have not lived anywhere near Ohio in thousands of years. Somewhere between 40 and 70 different species emerged from that single pit, many with bones so well preserved that surface texture was still visible after 10 millennia underground. That preservation is itself a quiet clue. cold, sealed, low in oxygen, undisturbed for thousands of years. This cave had not simply stored fossils, it had stored a trap. Animals fell in or were pulled in and did not come back out. Long before any humans stood at the rim, Sheridan Pit was already a machine for catching and preserving. Decades later, that same preservation began paying off in ways nobody standing over the pit in 1989 could have predicted. In 2017, researchers extracted ancient genetic material from peccary bone pulled out of the pit, recovering DNA from an extinct species that had been sitting quietly in Ohio dirt since before the last ice sheets pulled back. The cave was not only a graveyard, it behaves in a sense like a freezer that never lost power. Then in the mid-1990s, a student working the excavation named Kenneth Ford found something that redirected the entire project, a carved beveled bone point. Its edge deliberately shaped, the surface worked with clean, repeated strokes, not an animal bone bearing accidental damage from a fall, a weapon. Shaped, worked, intentional. That single object pulled archaeologists in behind the paleontologists. Kenneth Tankersley of Kent State and Brian Redmond of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History took over the deeper excavation, eventually supported by National Science Foundation funding. What they were chasing now was not simply Ice Age wildlife, it was Ice Age people. The method changed completely once the archaeologists took charge. Where the first phase had been a backhoe and a family chasing profit, the second phase was string grids, meter squares, line levels, gloved hands moving centimeter by centimeter. Every bone photographed in place before it was ever lifted. It is the kind of slow, disciplined work that almost never makes a headline, but it is also the only reason anyone today can actually trust the dates that came out of it. And there is a reason a date this precise matters so much to this particular corner of the field. For decades, the dominant model for how humans reached the Americas was known as Clovis first, the idea that a single wave of big game hunters crossed into the continent and spread rapidly, leaving behind a signature style of fluted stone point everywhere they went. Sheridan Cave does not overturn that model. It does something almost more interesting. It nails one small piece of the timeline down so precisely in a region far from the classic Clovis heartland that other researchers now treat it as a fixed point to work around. And the tools recovered here raised a question nobody could easily dismiss. The stone found near the bone points was not local. Some of it was chert traced back to outcrops in what is now Indiana and Kentucky, well over 100 miles away, in some cases closer to 250. Whoever stood at the edge of this cave was not a local forager working a familiar patch of forest. They were carrying material from long journeys or trading for it across a landscape most people still picture as empty, frozen, and unpopulated, which raises the obvious question. If people were moving that far that early, why does this site barely register outside specialist journals? And more importantly, if the bone weapon is treated as proof, what exactly was it proof of? This is where the story slows down, because this is where the evidence gets tested. In 2009, a research team led by Michael Waters, working alongside Thomas Stafford, Brian Redmond, and Kenneth Tankersley, ran a direct radiocarbon date on one of the bone points itself, not on nearby charcoal, not on an unrelated animal bone found close by, the tool itself. The result came back at 10,915 radiocarbon years before present, plus or minus 30 years. Translated into calendar years, that lands close to 13,000 years ago, and the margin of error on that number is almost unreasonably tight. 30 years on an object that old behaves less like an estimate and more like a scalpel. This was not a rough guess pulled from a stratigraphic layer. This became one of the most precisely dated Clovis-era artifacts anywhere in eastern North America. For a moment, that should have settled the debate. Humans here, with worked bone weapons right at the edge of the Clovis horizon. It did not settle anything, because a direct date only tells you when an object was made. It does not tell you what that object was doing at the bottom of an animal trap. And that is exactly the objection raised publicly by archaeologist Stuart Fiedel, who pointed out something uncomfortable. The bone points were not recovered from a clean living surface, no hearth, no obvious campsite floor. They came out of the same churned, trap-fed sediment that had already been swallowing animals for centuries before any human weapon ever entered it. If a hunter's tool and a dead peccary end up in the same layer of mud, a shovel alone cannot always tell you which one arrived on purpose. Which means the tightest, most confident number in this entire story, 10,915 years, tells you exactly when the tool was made, and almost nothing about what actually happened at that cave. Was someone hunting here? Was someone caching a weapon for later use, tucked away and never retrieved? Or did a tool simply fall into a hole that had already been swallowing bodies for generations, landing beside them by accident? The site's defenders, Redmond and Tankersley among them, argue that the tight clustering of tools and modified bone, including a snapping turtle vertebra carrying clear, deliberate cut marks, points to genuine human presence, not coincidence. The cut mark is not ambiguous. Someone with a blade was processing that turtle on purpose, with intent. That part is not seriously disputed. But here is where the story stops being only a story about stone tools and radiocarbon curves, because this land had a name for places like this long before anyone measured them in years before present. In the early 20th century, ethnographer Marius Barbeau spent years collecting oral tradition directly from Wyandot elders, work later published as a formal record of Huron and Wyandot cosmology and belief. Among what he recorded were accounts of small, unseen beings said to live beneath the earth and inside caverns, beings described as leaving marks on stone, and sometimes still heard singing and drumming underground, in places the Wyandot themselves were careful around. Alongside that account sits a second, older strand of Wyandot tradition, part of their creation narrative, a telling in which dangerous creatures made by a destructive twin were held and contained within a cavern, until a second, protective twin released the animals trapped inside and scattered the danger across the world. Some versions of that account, recorded from different Wyandot storytellers across different decades, describe the caverns as still holding echoes of what once moved through them, long after the danger itself was supposedly gone. Neither of these accounts names Sheridan Pit specifically. That has to be said plainly, and it is worth repeating rather than softening, but the pattern is difficult to ignore once you have stood at the rim of this particular hole. A cavern that for thousands of years silently caught and held animal after animal, sealed away from daylight, is not a new idea to the people whose ancestors lived along this exact ridge for generations before the state of Ohio existed at all. Whether the Wyandot elders who spoke of caverns holding hidden things were describing this cave, a cave like it, or something entirely symbolic is something no one can answer with certainty. But treating that oral record as noise rather than as a second line of evidence running parallel to the radiocarbon dates is its own kind of incomplete science. The story does not stop there either, because Sheridan Cave got pulled into a second separate controversy. In 2017, a research team led by Christopher Moore tested sediment from Sheridan Cave alongside several other sites across North America, searching for a specific chemical signature, platinum. The theory behind that search is one of the most contested ideas in Ice Age archaeology, the proposal that a cosmic impact or airburst roughly 12,800 years ago triggered a sudden cold snap and contributed to wiping out the very megafauna filling this cave. Sheridan's sediment layers were chosen as a test case, specifically because the dating here was already so tightly controlled. That theory remains heavily disputed. Most archaeologists remain skeptical of the impact hypothesis, and the debate over it is far from settled. Critics argue the platinum signal could come from ordinary geological processes rather than a cosmic event, and that the timing does not line up as cleanly as supporters of the theory claim. But the fact that this one Ohio sinkhole, dug open by a family trying to sell cave tours, ended up as evidence inside a debate about a possible ancient catastrophe tells you something about how far this discovery traveled from where it started. A hole behind a gift shop became a data point in an argument about how the Ice Age itself came to an end. So what actually happened here? A commercial dig, done for money, tore open a sealed Ice Age vault faster than anyone could properly document it. What survived that dig became genuinely important science, a date precise enough to anchor human presence in this region to within decades. That same evidence sits inside a debate that has never been cleanly resolved over whether this was a campsite, a cache, or simply a trap that happened to catch a human tool along with everything else. And running underneath both of those open questions is a third one, quieter and older than either. Whether the people who lived on this land the longest already understood, in their own terms, exactly what kind of ground this was. The fallout did not stay inside academic journals either. The fossils collected in that first paleontological phase are associated today with the Cincinnati Museum Center. The stone and bone tools are tied to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. But some of the photographed artifacts have circulated under a different label entirely, the Hendricks Collection, the same family name behind the original commercial dig. Two institutions, one private name, and no fully clean public answer about exactly where every piece legally sits, or who has final say over what happens to it next. Ask who benefits from each version of this story, and the picture only gets more complicated. A museum wants a clean, defensible timeline it can put on a label. A private family wants recognition, and perhaps value, for a discovery made on their own land. Academic careers were built, in part, on a precise, headline-ready date. None of that is corrupt. None of it is neutral, either. And that tension is still baked into how this site gets described today. What does it mean that the ground itself may have been remembered long before it was measured? Why does a story told for generations with no radiocarbon lab behind it land so close to what the lab eventually confirmed? And if oral tradition and hard science are pointing at the same hillside from two completely different directions, why do we still treat only one of them as evidence? At the site itself, Indian Trail Caverns, the roadside attraction that started this entire chain of events, reportedly closed its doors in 2018. A small Ohio historical marker still stands near the property, placed back in 2001, when the discovery was still fresh enough to be celebrated without much complication. The sinkhole that stayed sealed and climate stable for 10,000 years is now open to the sky again, exposed to rain, frost, and temperature swings, with no funded plan in place to protect whatever else might still be sitting undisturbed below it. Nobody set out to fake anything here. That is what makes this harder to dismiss than a simple hoax story. The radiocarbon date is real. The bone tools are real. The extinct animals are real. The Wyandot oral tradition is real, recorded and archived, not invented for this telling. This is not a story about forgery. It is a story about how thin the line is between proof and assumption, and about how easily a written record and a spoken tradition can describe the same hillside for a century without ever being placed side by side. A single precise number, with a 30-year margin of error, can tell you exactly when something was made, and still leave the most important question completely open. What was actually happening at that cave 13,000 years ago, when someone carved a weapon out of bone, and it ended up buried beside a herd of drowned peccaries in ground that later generations would still be careful never to fully explain? History, in the end, may not be a single fixed record waiting to be uncovered so much as an incomplete puzzle assembled from whatever pieces happened to survive, some pulled from radiocarbon labs, some carried for generations in memory, neither one complete on its own. Sheridan Cave does not resolve that tension. If anything, it sharpens it, by showing how close a written date and a spoken tradition can land to one another, without either one fully explaining the other. The sinkhole is still there, behind a closed gift shop, behind a fence, in a quiet part of Ohio most people will never visit. The bones that made it briefly famous are scattered now across 2 museum collections and 1 private name. The debate that made it complicated has never been resolved in a single peer-reviewed paper. And somewhere in that dark fenced pit, the ground is still holding the one detail nobody has ever fully explained, the difference between a footprint and a fall, and whether the people who lived closest to that hillside the longest already knew the answer. Thank you for watching. If stories like this one, where documented science and indigenous memory quietly arrive at the same conclusion from opposite directions, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to keep tracking down exactly that overlap. Before you go, one question worth sitting with. If a place your ancestors warned you never to open turned out to be hiding something real, Would you still believe the warning was only a story? I will see you in the next documentary.